I promise you that we will do that. Of course we will. I mean, of course, we now have a bit of a special situation. And maybe you heard such phrases before. A leader promises you something, and in due course of fulfilling the promise, suddenly it either changes, you only get a fulfillment of a part of the promise, or no fulfillment whatsoever. That's what we talk about today. I received quite a number of emails. Thank you very much for everyone emailing me, of people who said there seems to be a certain system in place which they wondered if it's correct or not to apply as a leader. In many situations, leaders give you a promise. It's often about either when you work in sales revenue or profit. Often they set you goals. They want to offer you a certain step or a development when it comes to your income, your salary, or they offer you a certain promotion when you do X, Y, Z. So the promise often is bound to you do something and you get something in return. The motivation of leaders doing so is pretty clear. They want to motivate you. However, some people think they can later either change it or only give you a part of what they promised due to certain circumstances, or they do not fulfill the promise at all. Many of the promises that were mentioned to me via email were broken. And unfortunately, when I talk to leaders, some people think breaking a promise will be okay because it happens sometimes. It seems to be that many leaders have the perception that it's not a big aspect of their work when this happens, because sometimes promises get broken, they experience it, so they think it's appropriate that they do the same. However, looking at the scientific evidence, the consequences of breaking promises are horrendous, and they are long-lasting, especially when it comes to your credibility and the trust. So we have to look at how to do it better. Step number one is that you stop to do the crisis talk. And the first step has three sub-steps, which often I hear always nearly the same. So there are three main categories which are applied in many different ways, but always with the same core message, where people say, I break the promise because, and it is either one, actually we have a crisis, or two, we're actually just recovering from a crisis, or the more rarely applied one, number three, is we're out of the crisis. However, now we need to make some savings to be ready for the next crisis, which is already in the making. And these three seem to be the reason why leaders often think they cannot offer much, or they can offer much but don't fulfill what they promised in the first place. Just a gentle reminder, and that is step number two here. You must be aware as a leader that the risk is always covered by the organization, not by the employees. People become employees for a reason. They do not want to have the entrepreneurial risk. If they want to have entrepreneurial risk, then they become self-employed. And by the way, when you now say, well, but we only hire entrepreneurial thinking people, then of course the question is, do you pay them accordingly? Which means you pay them like they are entrepreneurs. And in most cases, that is not the case. So you cannot talk about how people should be entrepreneurial, but get paid like employees. Be sure that you end this crisis talk, that you always hover around the same three phrases. Either you say, we have a crisis, or we're just out of the crisis, or we're out of the crisis right now, having savings and or making savings for the next crisis, which is already in the making. This three-step process, which often happens one after another, leads to the fact that people simply think you're lying to them. What you need is full transparency. And one thing is absolutely obvious. As soon as you have a crisis and people can publicly see that you're not making money, they see there are less jobs coming in, there are less gigs for the company, there's less revenue, there's less profit, there's less work to do, no one will claim that you have to fulfill the promise. As long as you can cover everything you demand them to accept, for example, that a promise is only kept or fulfilled partially, as long as you can show full transparency and the reason for why this promise is only fulfilled partially, people will accept that. People are not as unreasonable as they are often portrayed. The problem is way more on the leadership side than it is on the side of the employees. When you do not keep a promise, or you only fulfill it partially, you have to give people an outlook. So say, what is the next step? What is the outlook? What is the promise you can make from here? And by the way, if you think that you can be non-transparent, and we had quite a number of cases where people simply said, look, I just received an email from senior leadership, and senior leadership says there is no salary raise this year, no reason given. When you think that people accept that just because someone is sitting on board level, you definitely lost the plot quite some time ago, because people always expect that you are fully transparent because it is reasonable to do so. I just give you a very simple example. As soon as you're fully transparent, even with not so great news, people will accept you as a leader. Here's an example. A large organization which did okay but not great during the pandemic said, well, this year we have a salary raise of 2%. And of course, people said, well, that is way below the rise of living costs. It's basically a salary cut. And the leader said, yeah, it's very unfortunate. However, we cannot afford to do more. These are the numbers. I know this is actually a salary cut, and I'm very sad, but it's simply anything we can do from here, which will be a higher salary rise, would damage the organization in a way that we can't secure the business in the future. And the numbers were publicly available. And people were not happy, but they accepted it, and they still trusted their leaders for very obvious reasons. Full transparency, showing the facts, deriving actions from a factual situation. Don't try to portray anything you do in a way which is either not backed by science, not backed by facts, or not backed by both. I can just give you an example. So, for example, when you say, well, 2% salary raise actually is great. Most organizations don't give any salary raise. And also cost of living, that's a very personal thing. You could change something in your pattern of consumption to cover this up. And so actually it is a 2% salary raise, which is great in these times. So that was a phrase where not a single piece of what was said is factually backed, either by facts, science, proof, evidence, anything. It's 100% made up to make a leader look better than they actually are. As soon as you practice delivering lies to your people, your credibility drops basically to zero, because people will see that you are willing to make up any lie only to get away with an unreasonable, not fact-based decision, probably for your own benefit. And even if you don't show that it's for your personal benefit, people will always think it will be. Because even when you say at the moment there's a 2% salary raise, and then you say, but we're looking into it in September, then we know how the numbers of this year went. September, October, we're going to have a board meeting, 20th of October or 22nd or 27th, whatever date fits the schedule of anyone in the company, there will be a public announcement, and then we see where we go from there. It is possible that there will be another salary raise. However, we have to look at the numbers first and see how the markets and our customers' behavior develop. People will accept these statements. You can always make a statement about a prognosis. You can always make a statement about which tolerances do you have in financial in financial terms, plus minus a couple of thousand per year income. There are always ways how you can tell your people this is the next step to do. However, when you refuse to do so because you think, oh, it's too much work, it's just something I don't like to do. Well, figuring out a scope is just so much effort. Well, if you don't want to put this effort in, you probably should not be a leader. It is very important that when you give no information, because some people think, well, I could give a prognosis, but I don't. I won't give them any kind of scope or what kind of margins we have or where we still might do something for them. I'm not going to talk about that because they might then claim they should get more. As soon as you do not deliver a piece of information that anyone expects, people will close that gap by themselves. They will come to a conclusion, most likely to the worst case conclusion, and that always has the worst exit, the worst result, the worst consequences for the leader, for the organization, and for the employees. A chain of events will then follow. It normally means that people will publicly criticize you on platforms like Glassdoor or Kununu in Germany, in the German-speaking market, and that will harm you massively when it comes to employer branding. You have to spend way more money on recruiting, which makes the situation maybe even more challenging. Also, people will be less motivated, and when they are less motivation leads to a higher, of course, employee turnover, and that immediately affects not only higher costs for recruiting and damage to your employer's brand, you also have a low productivity, and that immediately affects the bottom line in your organization. And it's not the fault of the employee here. It is the fault of the leader. So here we see a process of how to do things better when it comes to either giving a promise and fulfilling it, or when you say, well, I can't fulfill it fully, or maybe I cannot fulfill it at all. And during the pandemic, this will have happened. Sometimes you have to say, look, we lost 80% of our business due to the pandemic. We're in the hotel industry. We have a bit of people coming in and out who travel through from governments. We are at 10% of the revenue, 5% of the profit we used to have. I cannot give you any salary raise. People will accept that. However, in that statement, you saw full transparency, and that is what you have to deliver. Of course, there's more available on the matter. Go to expert.nb-networks.com and put your email address in there. Every Wednesday morning, I send out an email. It's 100% content ad-free guarantee with everything that was published the week before. And via this email only, you get free access to all of these resources. Of course, when you now say, hey, a very specific question, because we have that problem, we have that situation in my organization, can I confidentially talk to you? Of course. Just drop me an email, nb@nb-networks.com, and then we either send emails or take it from there. Of course, when you have a very specific request, training, speaking, coaching, consulting, mentoring, or you say, hey, there's a project interim management program coming up, or you say, hey, we have an event and we need a host or someone who speaks there, happy to do that as well. But we can also just talk about this aspect we talked about today. nb@nb-networks.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. And of course, if you're listening to this podcast, I said it last week already, we will only be available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts in the future. So when you listen to this podcast and you want to listen to it in the future, go to Spotify and Apple Podcasts, because from the end of this month, there will be no podcast on any other but these two platforms, Spotify and Apple Podcasts. The most important aspect now is to apply what you heard, because you will only see the positive change you want to have or you want to see in your organization if you apply what you learned today. I wish you all the best implementing these patterns and these practices into your organizations. Always happy to help. And at the end of this podcast, there's only one thing left for me to say. Thank you very much for your time.